Hello, Eisenberg kids. This is your reading lesson for Wednesday, April 8th. And today we're going to be talking about what makes a poem a poem. So far this week, we've talked about drama or plays and the way that they're structured or set up. We've talked about stories and the way that they're structured and set up. So today we're going to talk about poetry. I'm going to start right up here at the top. I'm going to read through this whole introduction paragraph, and then I'm going to kind of go back and explain a few things and add some information. So if you have your notebook out, the things that I add in when I go back are maybe the things that you would want to write down since they're not right here on the page for you. Okay? All right, so I'm going to start right here at the top. Like stories and plays, poems communicate ideas and feelings, but poems have several features that are different from most stories and plays. Poems are usually arranged in lines. Groups of lines are called stanzas. A stanza is like a paragraph and focuses on a particular idea, scene, or event. Poems have rhythm, a music-like quality created by repeating words or sounds. Many poems rhyme. They repeat sounds at the ends of words. In addition, poems often use vivid, figurative language to create powerful images and feelings. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go back to the beginning. Think about like we do with math, how we go kind of one sentence at a time to make sure that we're completely understanding. I'm going to kind of do that with this first paragraph because there's a lot of information here. So first I want to talk about where it says poems are usually arranged in lines. So when we write a story in our notebook or on our Google Doc, our sentences follow one right after the other, and we always try to make sure that we have a complete thought in our sentences. But if you look at our example poem down here, if you read the first line, I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me. Look at the end. See how it ends with a comma and not a period? So that means that this first line is actually not a complete sentence. But even though it's not a complete sentence, they stop there and go ahead and switch to the next line. So that's one way that poetry is a little bit different from drama and plays because they are not written necessarily in complete sentences for each line. You can also notice that sort of like we number paragraphs in some of our reading texts, often authors will number the lines of their poems. So you can see the first section of this poem has 1, 2, 3, 4 lines. So each of these is a line. The next thing that I wanted to talk about from our introduction paragraph is it says groups of lines are called stanzas. So if you look at our example poem, you can see how the first 4 lines of this poem are grouped together, and then there's this little extra space, and then they have another 4 lines. Each of those groups is a stanza. So lines 1 through 4 is stanza 1. Lines 5 through 8 is stanza 2. So they look like paragraphs a little bit because of this extra space in between, and they're kind of grouped together. But they're different from paragraphs because they don't have complete sentences, and they're grouped by sets of lines instead of necessarily by ideas. Next thing in our introduction paragraph that I want to go over, it says poems have rhythm, a music-like quality created by repeating words or sounds. So this is, if you've ever read a poem on your own, you might have noticed that there's kind of a beat to the poem. And the way you read the poem, you can feel a rhythm. So I'm going to read our example poem down here, and I want you to kind of listen for that beat in the poem. So the poem is called My Shadow by Robert Louis Stevenson. I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me, and what can be the use of him is more than I can see. He is very, very like me from the heels up to the head, and I see him jump before me when I jump into my bed. The funniest thing about him is the way he likes to grow, not at all like proper children, which is always very slow. For he sometimes shoots up taller like an India rubber ball, and he sometimes gets so little that there's none of him at all. So as I read, I noticed that there was kind of a rhythm. So when I read this first line, I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me. You can kind of feel the beats in the syllables of the words. It kind of goes ba 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 ba. And then the next line has that same kind of rhythm. And what can be the use of him is more than I can see. Ba 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 ba. So it kind of has almost like a musical quality to it when you read it, and you can feel that beat. That's something that is specific to poetry. Often poetry has a beat or a rhythm that you can feel when you read it. Okay? Next thing, it says many poems rhyme. Now notice how it says many poems, not all poems. Poetry does not have to rhyme, but rhyming is one thing that makes poetry a little bit different from regular stories and from drama. So in this poem, you can see that there is rhyming. The rhyming comes in the very last word of every two sets of lines. So notice how line 1 ends with me, line 2 ends with C. Me and C rhyme. Then they start a new rhyme pattern. Head, bed. Head and bed rhyme. So the last word of each line is where that rhyme is created. Okay. The last thing I wanted to say, it says they often use figurative language to create powerful images and feelings. So we've talked about figurative language this year, but I want to give you a little reminder. Figurative language is when something is said in a very creative way that doesn't necessarily mean exactly what it says. So for example, we've talked about like the idiom, it's raining cats and dogs. That doesn't literally mean that cats and dogs are falling from the sky. It means that it's raining really hard outside. So there are a few parts in this poem where they use figurative language. They don't mean exactly what they say. They're trying to get you to picture and imagine things in a very clear, vivid way. So the first place that I noticed some figurative language is when it talks about the shadow jumping. It says, and I see him jump before me when I jump into my bed. Well, if you think about a shadow doesn't really have legs. I mean, it's kind of a picture of your legs, but shadows don't have their own legs. So shadows can't literally jump. So when they say that they see the shadow jump before him, he's talking about how sometimes when you're walking and you change direction and the sun is hitting you from a different angle, how it kind of looks like your shadow just pops out. But it's not saying that the shadow literally has a life of its own and jumps out before you. So this part is figurative language. Another part of this poem where they use figurative language that does not mean what it literally says is when it's talking about the shadow growing. It says the funniest thing about him is the way he likes to grow, not at all like proper children, which is always very slow. Well, we know that shadows can't really grow on their own. So they're talking about how as you're walking around, sometimes it looks like your shadow starts to kind of stretch and stretch and stretch. And that's what he's talking about right here. So that is also not literal. It's figurative language. It does not mean exactly what it says. All right, down here at the bottom, we have a few little questions to help you focus on what was most important in this lesson. And you can see I put the correct answer already in red for you. So it says the lines of the poem rhyme or do not rhyme, because not all poems have to rhyme. Well, we already decided that this poem did rhyme. Me, see, head, bed, grow, slow, ball, all. So this poem does rhyme. Number 2 says the poem blank rhythm. The poem has rhythm or does not have rhythm. Well, when we read the lines, we talked about how we felt that beat in the poem. So this poem has rhythm. 3 says the poem uses blank language, literal or non-literal. So literal is when it means exactly what it says. Non-literal is figurative language that doesn't mean exactly what it says, and we found some examples of non-literal language in this poem, so B is the correct answer. Last one, the poem is written in blank stanzas or a paragraph? Well, we know paragraphs are used in regular stories, not in poetry. We talk about the groups of lines in a poem as stanzas. All right, it's time for your independent work. And if you are doing the bonus work, look for some of these parts in the poems that I assigned to you on Epic, because a lot of the poems have these pieces, and that will help you get used to reading and looking for those parts in a poem. Love you, miss you, and I'll see you for math.